Silly me, that must have come off as implying that I was considering taking a deeper look at the subject matter, maybe considering films with far more controversial themes. I'm sure nobody's interested in that. Unless... Hey and welcome to Proper Horror Show. This week we are covering Eden Lake. This is a film that I have wanted to talk about for absolutely ages because there is so much to say about this film. It is often just written off as another torture porn film, as so many wonderful modern horrors are, but it is a fantastic modern horror. It has got really strong performances from Kelly Reilly, from Michael Fassbender and from Jack O'Connell, and the director James Watkins uses this really strong premise to just deliver an unflinching, harrowing and really difficult tone throughout the whole film. But what I'm going to focus on today is the misinterpretation of the film, the difficulty that seemingly many critics have with the source of Eden Lake's horror. Now, Eden Lake is a very difficult watch for many people, and for some it's because of the intensity of the horror and the violence, but for other people it's because Eden Lake does something very challenging. It doesn't go for a safe target, and Eden Lake does something very politically incorrect. So get ready, because this vid's about to get heavy. I'm just setting out my premise. I'm spaghetti. First off, what is Eden Lake about?
On one level, it is a kind of Daily Mail headline theme, but I don't think this is essentially a paedophobic horror track, despite the fact that some people have said that it is. Because what happens is that in the end, it's a shaggy dog story about out-of-control feral kids. And
at bottom, it's about older people and the young, a gang of feral children who are as powerful as adults.
No. Wrong. No. Wrong, and maybe knowingly wrong? I don't know. Both these reviews sort of dance around the real problem of Eden Lake, which is that it's not finding its horror in kids, but it's finding its horror in class, and not in the right direction. So Mark Kermode hints at the class aspect that's really behind Eden Lake when he references the Daily Mail, and Pete Bradshaw sort of winks at it by referencing gated communities and the opposition to them. But I think they are both aware that Eden Lake is really a horror film told from the perspective of the British middle class, encountering an underclass that they are horrified by and a reality that they find they have no way of dealing with. The premise is very simple. A middle class couple travels to the countryside for a sort of lovely getaway, and they are terrorised by a gang of violent teenagers who are very much Chavs. That is a British term for a sort of violent, antisocial members of the working class, albeit they're not particularly known for working.
Hey guys, do us a favour and turn the music down. On A, mate. Turn your sounds down. On A, mate.
Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, Guardian journalist and fist connoisseur Owen Jones saw the class aspect of Eden Lake straight away and was not scared to address it. Now, Owen Jones is half right here, because Eden Lake is absolutely concerned about a feral underclass, but it's not straight up demonisation. It makes plenty of points that Owen could nod along with. For example, the middle class folk concern over the construction of a gated community in such a lovely setting, whilst happily having big barriers against the underclass themselves. Owen can probably relate. He's not too comfortable around the gammon himself. And there was this moment that really stood out to me and stands out to me every time I watch the film because it really rings true to me. This sort of middle-class sneering annoyance at out-of-control children are sort of blithely wishing for strict punishment, and then...
They're past their bedtime, isn't it?
Yeah, poor things must be exhausted.
That child needs a good...
Bloody told you!
Now, as a pretty middle-class person, I really recognise that, yeah, guilty. There's a very typical middle-class sort of blitheness, talking about very harsh realities, and yet a complete inexperience with them and inability to handle them. James Watson also really captures that sort of middle-class assumption of universal reasonableness that tends to scupper us. Now, all these aspects get observed, they get highlighted, and they get commented on and thereby challenged. And I think it's these very nice, astute class observations that make Eden Lake such a brilliant British horror film. They really mark it out as a very intelligent and well-observed film and an unmistakably British horror film. But unfortunately for Owen Jones and his set, the film doesn't limit its criticism to the safe target of the middle class. Eden Lake dares to acknowledge and highlight the heresy that there is something very real and very scary happening in and leaking out of Britain's poorest communities. And that is a problem for critics because in the language of the left, Eden Lake is punching down. And how very dare it? British viewers of this video and Eden Lake will be well aware that from the mid-2000s, horrific incidents of violence and torture from Chavs started to get media attention, likely because they leaked out and targeted middle-class people. The Mick Philpott case and the Sharon Matthews incident, they showed how far gone some places were, places that middle-class people would never go. But people were also aware of the fairly common sight of intimidating gangs of youths in sportswear loitering in streets, in alleys, and I know it sounds daft to find 13 and 14-year-olds intimidating, but in packs of 8, knowing that some of them are armed, and most of all knowing that the rules of polite society, the Waitrose formalities, do not apply, yeah, that is intimidating. And far from being over, London still has a knife crime epidemic among urban youths. That is an ongoing issue. For the sort of people who get to be mainstream commentators, showing Chavs as a source of horror is a heresy.
Oh my god, Karen.
You can't just point out a serious problem in a favoured group without very swiftly moving on to show that the blame lies actually with, say, a lack of funding or the price of fresh fruit or whatever it is. So just as long as you pivot fast enough to cause a small tornado in Islington. Heavens no. Now, I have said plenty of times on this channel that in order to properly interpret some media, you need to know the concept of safe targets. What I mean by that is there is no problem whatsoever with society, the people under the stairs, or the rather excellent and underappreciated Would You Rather, showing the wealthy upper class as degenerate sadistic sociopaths. That's all gravy. But if you were to suggest that it's got unreasonably stabby a little lower down the socioeconomic scale, then that gets a bit uncomfortable. Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that Eden Lake is remarkable for showing a very real source of horror for regular people, and a source of horror that is politically incorrect. Eden Lake is incredibly powerful because the horror that it displays is extremely relatable. It takes these commonplace moments of sort of antisocial toxicity, of intimidation, aggressiveness, and juvenile delinquency, and these are things that you've seen in your daily life, and then the plot moves only slightly beyond incidents that you'll have seen reported in the headlines. That relatability is the reason Eden Lake is so powerful, because the relatability means you can connect to the characters. When you can connect to them, you empathise. And the more you empathise with them, the stronger the fear that you feel is. But even so, it is still kind of funny to me that mainstream critics struggled so much with Eden Lake because Eden Lake was already pulling its punches. This film, pulling its punches? How can I explain this? So, the threat comes from knife-wielding teens who kill someone by necklacing them. Wikipedia that in your own time. Who's doing this? These guys in rural England. So this analysis has just focused on the class aspect of Eden Lake and the difficulty that it caused so many critics. But I do want to emphasise that Eden Lake is in its own right an excellent horror film. The relatability of Eden Lake makes it hit harder, and the ending is absolutely unforgettable. I mean, the director James Watkins, in his other work, in My Little Eye, in The Woman in Black, and in the episode of Black Mirror that he directed. If there's a consistency, it is that he can really land an ending that sticks with you. I really want to see this guy making more horror films. But as for the wider theme of this video, the bigger question if you will, I kind of wonder maybe there's another film where real life horror and socially acceptable horror clash. Some pretty heavy stuff in this video. I hope it was still interesting to you, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts below, because I'm really putting my own take out there. As ever, if you like what I do, please do also like the video and subscribe. As I say every time, I'm a tiny channel and every new subscriber is an absolute delight. I really do love seeing that people are appreciating my work by sort of making a very solid signal of subscribing. It really does make my day, and it sort of encourages me, sort of motivates me to keep on going. Yeah, so that is all from me this week. Obviously a fair bit more to say, but that will go into another video. Thanks y'all. Cheers.
Real Horrorshow.